follow you. Yep. Here we go.
Here we go.
Welcome, friends. Welcome to our second episode of Asking for a Friend. We're asking each other questions, some that we've received from you and some that we actually ask of each other. I have this line here, questions are our friends. It made me think of, I think it's either Finding Dory or Finding Nemo, where there's a gathering of sharks and they're like, fish are our friends, not food. And it's like, you know, questions are our friends. They're not frightening. It's okay. Sometimes Christians are afraid that someone's going to ask a question that they won't have the answer to, or even in their own minds, I got this question and I'm afraid to ask it. And we say, ask away. God's not afraid of the truth. You were thinking about what happens when a friend comes and asks you a question and maybe you don't have the answer.
Yeah, I think we don't have to be afraid of the questions, and we don't have to be afraid of not knowing either. That it's okay to say, I don't know that, but here's what I do know, or I can put you in touch with resources. It's just not something we need to be nervous about at all.
Yeah. The root of the strength of my Christian faith would be around conversations with people. And it isn't that I go away by my Bible and read it by myself and then it all locks in and makes sense. I meet with some guys early on Saturday morning, meet with some high school students on Monday nights, and it's the conversations.
Yeah.
And I know that's the same, it's the same in your life. So we do want to tackle some of these, I think, really good questions, but I wanted to start with a personal one of you. You're doing your PhD. And I'm interested in two things. The first one is just, what is it about? How do you explain it to a dum-dum like me that has a hard time understanding complex things?
So I'm doing a PhD in organizational leadership with Eastern University. And my focus, I'm in the dissertation phase right now, and I'm doing my research study. So I'm focusing on women who work in Christian organizations, because it can be pretty challenging for women to be in leadership roles in any context, but it's especially hard in some Christian organizations. And what women often hear is that we need to develop more skills in order to grow as leaders, which can be absolutely true. And yet what we're finding is that it's the relationships that women have around them. So coaches or mentors or colleagues or family, those are the things that make the biggest difference for women in launching them and sustaining them in leadership. So I've got a survey open and I'm inviting women to tell me about the relationships that they've had that have been significant for them. Okay.
I think you answered my second question.
Great.
Which would have been,
sufficient.
Why is this so important? But it's clearly, you have investment in leaders, I know, across genders, both genders, but you're seeing a real need for this.
Yeah, I think it's really important that when we talk about women in leadership, I mean there are unique challenges that women have. And the reason it's important is because when women and men work together in leadership, it's just good for organizations. It's that co-leadership that is so powerful. And so it's not about diminishing men so that women can rise to the top. Not at all. It's so that we can have our churches and our organizations really take advantage of what research is showing is just so good for all of us.
I agree with that. I've benefited from having you. Okay, so spoiler alert, maybe this is the question you aren't ready for, but there's extra challenges for women in leadership. Just, can you give us one? Like, what is it that a woman could face in leadership that a man is less likely to face?
Yeah, there are lots of things. I think maybe the biggest one is that we expect leadership to have kind of a male flavor to it, if that makes sense. We've grown up with this, and culturally we expect that, and so it can be hard for women to who typically have a different style of leadership, for them to be even seen as leaders. And when they adopt more stronger characteristics or characteristics to fit in with a male culture, then they can get almost punished for that. So it's what's called a double bind, and it can be pretty challenging for women.
Okay. Coming to a bookshelf near you? Yeah?
Once I get this survey done.
Yeah, cool. Okay, let's just jump right into the deep end of the pool here. Yeah. And the question is, who is Jesus? And maybe specifically, is Jesus God or is he God's son? So Give us a start on that.
Yeah, I love this question. And so yes, Jesus is God, and yes, he is God's son. But I think that question, when I hear it, it's most often asking, is Jesus like kind of second in command? Is God president and Jesus is vice president? That's absolutely not it. When we see Jesus, we see God. And that is so beautiful because Jesus is able to reveal God to us in a way we can understand. He's a person, and so we can see God's humility and his gentleness and his love for us in the person of Jesus in a way that we actually couldn't understand any other way. So yes, Jesus is fully God.
So sometimes people say like Jesus and God. Yeah, that is not it. And what's fascinating for me, and this is troubling certainly for Muslim friends, the Trinity is a stumble block, right? And Father, Son, Spirit. There's a time when Jesus is explaining to one of his disciples, and he was talking about after he dies. And he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So great, hang on to that. Sometimes we forget the next piece of the conversation where Philip says, "Just show us the Father and we'll be happy." And Jesus says, "Philip, I've been with you all this time. It just feels like there's such oneness within the Trinity that Jesus could actually say, "Hey, when you see me, you see the Father. When you experience the Holy Spirit, you experience me." And there's this movement back and forth, neat deferring to each other. Yeah, good, okay.
And I think that just made me think that as we're talking about answering questions and being in conversations, I mean, Jesus is ground zero for us with our faith. And I think that when we're in conversation with people and we maybe don't know how to respond to a particular question, it's often really helpful to just go back to Jesus. Everything works out from there. And so even in many of the questions we're looking at today, I think starting with Jesus is just the best place to begin. So talking about beginnings though too, another question that we've had is, okay, God, what was his beginning? One person put it, who created God?
So neat question. I'm trying to figure out what's behind that because it just feels like a never-ending sort of scene. So I would say that's a category mistake. We have this sense of cause and effect. Something comes from original mover, original cause, and yet we want to keep applying it. And so if we say category error, that means that God's above these kinds of questions. God's above needing to be caused. He's beyond needing to be moved. And that would be by definition a different category. C.S. Lewis, guy that's way smarter than me, he explains that question. He said, we've made this category mistake. And it's not like we relate to God like, say, William Shakespeare's neighbor related to Shakespeare. Upstairs, downstairs. We're in the same category. We're both tenants, but you just live in a different spot. He's saying we relate to God like Hamlet relates to Shakespeare. That Hamlet's written into the script by Shakespeare. Shakespeare's a genius that allows Hamlet to live and actually take shape. And so the only way that Hamlet has any understanding, if this is even a thing for Hamlet, is for Shakespeare to write himself into the script, which is exactly where you were going, which is exactly what God has done with Jesus. This is the amazing thing for me. If I could know God, wouldn't that be, and I think this is what people have wanted all along, and Jesus is like, here it comes. If I want to know what God is like, I don't have to look anywhere beyond best place to start, best place to finish is Jesus. And so we will push, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John at someone and say, read about him. Listen to what he says, watch what he does, and see how much he loves you, how much he loves people in these stories. So, neat question. I think Lewis started that whole thing about, category mistakes because he was listening to a newscast back in his day before the Americans walked on the moon. The Russians were actually the first into space. And when the Russian cosmonaut who was in the space shuttle or whatever it was, rocket ship, got into outer space, he said, "There is no God up here. Just saying, we're first here, there is no God." And that's when Lewis said, "You've made a category mistake. It's not like God's upstairs and we're downstairs. This is a whole different, not creature, but creator." Okay, so take your principle of let's start with Jesus, and you're going to wind this in somehow. But it feels to some people like to be a Christian means to give up on science. You have to check your brain at the door, and particularly around the origins of the earth, particularly around creation story that the Bible gives and evolution as scientists are working through this theory and getting deeper on it. How do you approach science as a Christian?
I think there are two groups of people for whom this question is important. The first are the group of people who are curious about faith and who are wondering. I'm thinking of my atheist or agnostic friends or people I've had conversation with around faith, and they feel that they have to check their brains to accept Jesus, or they can't accept evolution if they're going to follow Jesus, and they just are convinced by the science of evolution. And so to them, I would say that shouldn't be a barrier to following Jesus, that we can absolutely have a robust faith in Jesus and a deep appreciation for the elegance and the beauty of science, including evolutionary science. So I am someone who does accept evolution as how God created things, and I love Jesus, and the two I find can integrate very well. There are other people who ask this question, and I think they're coming more from a faith perspective. And these people, I think this question makes them scared or even angry, because it feels like if evolution is true, then my faith just all falls to pieces. And this is where I think it is important that we go back to Jesus. Jesus is ground zero for our faith. Jesus crucified, resurrected, and everything works out from there. And so because Jesus said, all scripture is fulfilled in me, this is one story that points to Jesus, we have a high view of scripture and appreciation of scripture. And we read it to understand and know Jesus. And so I think that can help us approach Genesis, which I think is often really problematic for people who are concerned that if the Bible is not literally true and isn't mirroring science, then either science is false or my faith is false. I think we can read Genesis very differently and with a lot more grace for ourselves and allow the Bible to be what it actually is. So I think those two people, I would just say, doesn't need to be a barrier. But actually, I am curious. I know that you probably are in a similar place with science. What would you say to that?
So I think you said it, but the assumption is that when we open the Bible and look to the first chapter, that we've got an explanation on how God created the earth. And I think that the Bible is going after a more important question, though I think science is important. It's the why.
Yeah.
The why gives this sort of momentum for the purpose of life. And then we can sort it. We can sort it from there. You probably want to talk about literary genre. Well, how do you, because this is the thing, right, for people, is how do I understand my Bible then if I can't believe what it says? It says 6 days or 7 days, and now you're telling me it's not 6 days or 7 days. And so, everything's out the window. So I have a couple thoughts on it, but I'm interested just in terms of the way you would look at the various pieces of the Bible. And I mean, literary genre, I just like saying the word genre because it makes me sound intelligent, but there is something to that, right?
For sure. I mean, we look at Psalm 23 and we would miss the whole point and all of the truth that's in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, if we tried to make that literally true. It just doesn't work. And so there are different places in the Bible where different forms, different genres are there. And to understand the truth that they're telling us about God and his love for us and how he wants to relate to us, we need to appreciate the form that's there. So the form that I think we find most in the early part of Genesis is this form that's called myth. And we can get a little bit nervous about that because we think it's the same as fairy tale. But this type of writing is trying to convey deep truth about who we are and what our purpose is and what is the meaning of life. And it's this form of writing that's designed for that. And that's what we find in the first chapters of Genesis.
What's interesting, this is I'll probably belabor this. Maybe we'll take this out of the podcast.
Sure.
When I was in Israel, and I had this guide, and we were at this site that's called the Primacy of Peter. It's where Roman Catholics believe that Jesus declared Peter to be the Pope. And he asks me from my New Testament, do you know why there's 153 fish? You know, and they count all the fish up, 150. I don't know. He goes, any number that's divisible by 3 points to God. And I mean, I actually said, have you thought about the Trinity? Because he's a Jewish guide. And have you thought about Jesus being in the grave for 3 days? And he's like, whatever. But he said the reason why we have this regard for the number 3 is the creation story. Because we see it as 2 threes. The first 1, 2, 3 days are when God creates habitations. And then the last ones, 4, 5, 6, are where he creates inhabitants for the habitations. And they saw it 2 very distinct things, 2 threes. And so even then I thought, okay, so you guys aren't trying to force a scientific explanation on this. You're looking for the deeper meanings, the why, and how it is that God works. You know, on this, both my wife and I, we did undergraduate degrees in science, and Colleen did a biology degree, and she got a little bit cooked for having Christian convictions. She got laughed at times. She recalls one time when she was in a lab. Actually, I think she was in the professor's office out of this lab. And she says to this guy, Dr. Allen, it seems like there might be a God, because they were looking at something fantastic. It was a plant biology course. And he goes over to the office door and shuts it and says to her, I will deny this if you ever report it to anybody else. But I see too many amazing things in here to believe that this all happened by chance. So it's kind of all right, it's too bad that scientists are scared.
Yeah.
And I think increasingly less so. People like Francis Collins are saying, I don't actually see the compete. I actually see this beautiful dovetail of this conviction that Earth is good and laws of nature, and believing then that there would be a good lawgiver to that. So, yeah.
And so then kind of along those lines, as we're talking about creation and God creating the world and then his intention in creating us, we have a question from someone. I'm just actually going to read it as it came in, and then you can decide how you want to take it apart here. But I didn't get the choice to be born. Like, that choice was made for me. But why do I then, as a human, have to choose God? And if I don't, the consequences are pretty severe. Like, I'm going to burn in hell. So I didn't get this choice. Why is this choice forced on me? So there's kind of a couple of answers. Oftentimes there's like a pastoral response. You're talking to a family in a hospital about a difficult situation that they're looking at, and there may be a theologically correct answer. That's not the time for it, right? And so it's a different moment. And not that you have 2 different truths, but just wanting to be careful. So if that was in my living room and we were back and forth, I'd say, hey, it sounds like you may have been hurt, or you're angry. You don't like your life right now. Can we talk about that? Because that could just slide towards resentment and all kinds of life bitterness. And the Bible actually has lots of place for people to be angry and struggle. And so something like half of the Psalms that are in the Bible's prayer book are laments. People just shaking their fists at God, saying, what are you thinking? Where are you? What are you doing? The bad guys are winning, the good guys are losing, and you don't seem to care anymore. And God puts it in the book. Says, well, that's good stuff.
Let's keep that in the book, right? I would sanitize all that stuff out. Let's just go with the happy people with the big smiles. And God says, no, this is actually the conversation I want to be having with you. So theologically, I'd want to say to the person, you were designed for a relationship. All these bits of you that are emotional and relational and angry and loving and interested and disinterested, these are all indications of a longing for what God has created you for. My wife, Colleen, she might be the most pathologically relational person I know. We have bird feeders in our front lawn, and she goes out there and the goldfinches all scatter. And she's like, how come they can't figure out that I'm the one that fills the bird feeder? How come they don't line on my arms and love me? And it was like, yeah, okay, I get it. And isn't that what God has done in Jesus? I think we said, you'd have to become a goldfinch, babe, and so she's like, that's kind of what God has done in Jesus so that we could know him. So, why am I forced onto this planet? I didn't choose to be born. I mean, gosh, keep going. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose your brother and sister. You didn't choose anything. And you could live your life resentful and bitter. And that's one of the options for you. I think it would be, gosh, what a waste of a great gift. I'm going to say one more thing, but do you have thoughts on it?
No, I like what you're saying. I think that the question behind the question is the important one here, that we are not promised the best life right now. God never says that what we have right now, is perfect and is going to be trouble-free, and there will be parts of it that are hard. And he, like you said, he does encourage us to bring that to him. But he does seem to suggest that this is the best way to the best world, that he's going to take everything bad and somehow redeem it and make it better than it was, perfect, and better for having had the hard parts of this life. I don't understand it all, but that seems to be what he's promising us.
Jesus told a story about 3 guys that were given gifts, and for whatever reason, the word is actually talents, which was supposed to be a big chunk of money, big lump of gold. And one guy's given 5 talents, and the other guy was given 2 talents, and the last person was given 1 talent. And 2 of them went off and just had a lot of fun with what they had. Not surprisingly, the one with 1 got resentful and bitter, buried the gift. And when he explains to the master why he buried the gifts, I knew you were a hard man. I knew this. And it struck me that maybe we all see ourselves as the 1 talent person, right? And so we're like, I'll show God. And I think, gosh, you don't actually know how good it is that you've got what you've got. And I think it was a cautionary tale, too, to those of us who feel like we got the short end of the stick. We're not as handsome or smart or whatever else. And, that is our wrong perception. And I always feel like everybody else has got it better. And that's a miss. Anyway, interesting.
So kind of, can I follow up with another question?
Okay, sure, yeah.
So we've been talking about God, we've talked about Jesus, but a question we've had is, aren't all religions basically the same? And so why does Christianity seem so exclusive? Aren't they all saying the same thing? Aren't we all doing the same thing?
Yeah. So I think I quoted earlier, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. And Christians have held on to that. And lately, maybe it's always been the case, there's pushback, that's arrogant. How dare you impose your culture on anyone? Everybody is equally, valuable in their perspective. And so I would say, yes, Christianity 100% is exclusive. And I would say, so is every other worldview, including the one that says you can't impose your culture on another person. That's a truth claim. That's a way of saying, I am going to tell you how it is. You want to tell me that Jesus is the way to hope, and I'm going to tell you that nobody can make that claim. So both of those things are equal and exclusive truth claims, equal in power. I don't think equal in truth. So then maybe the response is, well, then how do you ever find out what is? Maybe we can't ever know. And I would say, no, look at those things for what they are. Explore the evidence for them. And, this doesn't always bear out, but I think there is some merit to it. What difference does it make? What difference has it made on planet Earth? There's lots of stories of where Christians have failed and really dropped the ball and did things that were so unlike Jesus. But there are also many stories where people have walked with Jesus, have believed what he said, have obeyed and learned his teaching, and their effect has been transforming. I think about your uncle in Africa and his experience with a certain culture and a certain religious background, and then him meeting Jesus and how that has meant such an amazing transformation in his country of Ghana.
Yeah.
What about you? How do you approach the exclusive claims of Christianity and Jesus?
I think you're right that Jesus is exclusive. He doesn't give us the option of Jesus and someone else. And I think it is therefore a mistake to say all religions are saying the same thing. If you line any of them up and people of faith within any of these faiths, we would say, no, we are saying very different things. We're not making the same claims. And I agree with you, they are all mutually exclusive.
Tim Keller tells a story about being in New York City, and he was on a panel of himself and an imam, a Muslim imam, and it was a Jewish rabbi. And so the students were all listening, and these three men made their presentations. And the students said, "You believe the same thing." And all three of them said, "No, we don't. We don't believe the same thing." And they said, "Yes, you do." And it was like this fear of somebody actually having the authority to say, this is the right answer, follow this. If you say, they're all worth the same, which is kind of like not much, then I can shrug my shoulders and make my way and believe that my own little version of life is the true one. But each of them are saying, and Keller actually said in that context, listen, I'm gonna make it super clear that the claims that I'm making for Jesus Christ either reveal him to be superior to these two, or inferior to, but in no way can I pretend like this is an equal claim to them. And at least the guys in the panel agreed with them. Okay, but it does then raise this question about how do we get along? And sadly, sometimes Christians are the meanies, we're mean people, and sometimes, and I have this in my own life, my atheist friends are the nicest people. So how do you make sense of that? Like, if you guys know the truth, then how do you get away with this being crabby?
It's so true. I think of my atheist and agnostic friends and neighbors, and they're way nicer than I am. Like, there are some really nice people out there. So, but I think that's actually the beauty of the gospel, right? Is that it's all about Jesus. And so Jesus is the answer, if you could put it that tritely. Jesus has the truth. It's not we who have it, but we are throwing ourselves at his feet, or we're casting our lots in with him and saying, yes, this is not working, but Jesus is the way. And it is sad when we don't live into what he calls us into, but that's not a reflection of who he is. I think it was C.S. Lewis who talked about this problem, and he said one thing you should also do is imagine just how nasty the person would be without Jesus.
Yeah. I represent that remark.
That's right. So yeah, what would you say to that one?
So there's always this dilemma about how good are the good people, and again, I quote Tim Keller way too much, but he's worth quoting. He talks about the need for bad people to repent of their bad things, and for good people to repent of their good things, which that doesn't make sense. But it does, because the cross of Jesus Christ says that there's no way to a relationship with the living God except by him dying in our place and our sins being forgiven. And so I don't know what's in your life. I don't have as many criminal friends as I do very nice people. And they take a fair amount of confidence in their goodness. And they will say, I don't need to go to church. I don't need God because I'm good enough. And I'm like, you might want to check that with the person who's got the scorecard, right? Because as long as I'm comparing with other people, or the certain other people anyway, I might feel good about myself. But when I come before God, before Jesus, and he tells me, be holy like I am holy, then I find out I'm just as much of a gangster as anyone else. And I need the same elephant dose of medicine to cure my disease, which is prettied up. I try to make sure that people see a good side of me and they know the good piece of Andrew, but it isn't all good by any stretch, not just in my behavior, but in my thoughts and desires. So I hear that, I own that. The message of the cross isn't to try to make good people a little bit better. It's to admit that all have sinned and all fall short. And there is a way. There is a way to get right and then become right. Like Jesus, actually, we get to grow and look like him and be mean less often. That's good. Okay, maybe connected, maybe not connected, but how do you make sense of a God who is good but allows bad things to happen to good people? How do you sort through that, what seems to be a breach of justice?
Yeah, I want to hear what you will say to this too. That is such a big question, and it is one that I don't think we can fully answer, because we are talking about a great and infinite God who has this very long-term plan for a beautiful renewed creation, and he has allowed suffering to be a part of this creation. And he is the God who says he's always with us in suffering, and he is always working it together for good. That doesn't mean we can always see the good. Having said that, I think that we can sometimes get glimpses, because we hear about this and experience it ourselves over and over again. When we go through suffering, when we experience hard things, we become different people. And when God is in that and using that, we become usually stronger, more loving, kinder people. And a lot of people would say, I wouldn't want to go through that suffering again, but I also wouldn't exchange that for what I learned through that for anything. So that's kind of a little glimpse that we can get of it. But for me, really, it does come down to Jesus again. And the only response I have at the end of the day for suffering is Jesus on the cross. And whatever the reason is behind it, all of the suffering, we have a God who chose to come and live among us and enter into the very worst suffering. It says, for the joy that was set before him. And so this was something he thought it was well worth the while to go through, and I can rest with that. I bet you would add some stuff.
Well, so Yancey made that point about, well, God actually played by the same rules. We can surrender to this. And I mean, this is the, not the punchline, this is the difficult piece. And, we have couples in the church who had a little baby die, or, other kinds of grief that we just, we shudder to think about, and sort of waltz in and say, well, God knows what he's doing. That doesn't feel good either. Your relationships can be way better after. We don't mean to say those sorts of things. That's a place and Jesus told us to weep with those who weep, and just keep the answers in your back pocket. But you're right. There's these stories that we have of people who've gone through these horrific things who now look back and say, wow, I didn't actually know Jesus like I do now. And unfortunately or fortunately, I had to go through that. We know other stories where people suffer and it ruins them. They just can't absorb it. They can't swallow it. They chafe, fight, and it ruins them. But when we look back on our lives, it's usually those things where we've struggled that have grown the character. Somebody said recently that Suffering may ruin your life, but no suffering in your life. It's like someone hovers around you like a helicopter parent, tries to take all the slivers out of the piece of wood for you, put it in, take all the bones out. No suffering is proven to absolutely ruin you. So that's, again, there's two responses to this.
I agree.
Yeah.
Kind of along the same lines of talking about God as this, a person of love, a loving God, and then hard things in life. And so how can we say God is loving when it seems that Christians carry this message that LGBTQ people just aren't accepted for who they are?
Yeah, not accepted for who they are, and kind of like God must not love them. So I guess my response would be, I'm not entirely sure I'm accepted as I am. So the question is, how come, are they not good enough? And I would say they're not actually good enough, and neither am I. And I don't mean this in any false humility, but I might be just even less good than my LGBTQ friends. I could just feel it when I'm around them. If someone else is doing the measuring, I certainly feel like that. The message of the cross of Jesus Christ is that none of us are good enough, zero. And he's the only one that can make us good before God. And that just puts the ground at the foot of the cross level. So nobody comes in with like half a step up than the rest of us. The beautiful and the smart and the wealthy, they don't get like a special business class treatment, and I'm back here flying economy. It's this whole thing. We either accept the goodness and the grace, the forgiveness that Jesus gives us, or we fold our arms angrily and say, God has to take me the way that I am. And I don't think that that's fair for anybody. I don't think that that's what God says to anybody. Oh, you're Presbyterian. Oh no, come right here to the front of the line for sure. Oh, you've got none of it, right? And not the Hindus, the Muslims, the atheists. No, the same response to all of them, including our LGBTQ friends. I love you. Will you, like everyone else, come and confess your sin and find forgiveness for this? And will you trust me? We live this life out together. That's the invitation. We have to say, though, that that's an extra challenge. That's an extra challenge to have a longing for intimacy that has got a prohibition sign on it. And so way too long, we've waved our fingers and say, ooh, or you shouldn't be that way, or those sorts of things. And you and I both want to say, dang, that's not our struggle, but we want to figure out what it is to love you and love God together. Will you come on the journey, with us? One of the guys that had some influence on us was like, before we get talking about your sexual orientation, can we talk about your spiritual orientation? Because that's really the piece that matters most. And then our sexuality, and whether we are single or married, out of that can sort itself out in its own awkwardness. None of this is like, oh, that's amazing. We'll work it out together, but let's talk about our orientation, our position around who God is, Jesus, and sort ourselves from there. I want to say something about community, but actually I want to hear what you have to think about that question.
I think that's really important. The community that we form around one another, and taking that so seriously, because we all need intimacy, regardless of our life circumstances. I think too, it's helpful to say, it probably needs to be said in our cultural climate, that there is this sense that if you accept me, for me to feel accepted by you, you must agree with everything that I say and think and do. And I think we have to separate those two. We can have differences of opinion. We can talk about things differently and still accept one another. I don't think that acceptance demands an immediate alignment of all opinions. And I think that's a false move that our culture would make us make sometimes.
Think back 60 years ago when this was all sort of sexual revolution was going on, and there was sort of more momentum, more voice being found for, at least for gay and lesbian experience. And for whatever reasons, the church really frowned on this and came down hard and loved any law that was criminalizing and has been harsh on this group of people. I wish, and maybe, the best time to plant an oak tree is 60 years ago, second best is now. I wish that when those individuals had come into the church, people would have said, whoa, no, that's not my challenge, but I struggle with looking at pornography, or I've had an affair, or I'm an alcoholic, or whatever else, other issues. We're all got some junk. Your thing is its own different thing, but do you want to go after Jesus with us? I wish that had been our story. There's a story about a guy that was drug addicted. This is a little bit of a shift. A little drug addicted, was California, Jesus people, but this was just a guy who was clearly high, and he stumbled into a church, and he wandered to the front of the sanctuary, and he sat down at the front, cross-legged, and everybody's horrified. They're all there with their suits and their ties and their white gloves on and hats. And one of the elders got up and walked up to the front, sat down beside this guy, took his shoes off and crossed his leg and sat there cross-legged. And
that's beautiful.
Yeah, that's where I want to be. Like, I have nothing on anyone, and I'm a beggar who thinks he's found food, and I want to share the food.
Yeah. One more question, and then I'm going to ask you to close this out because I'm a disaster at closing things. But question, I'm going to read this one because, again, it feels like it's a tough one. This comes from someone like, why did God make me this way? So, I'm not happy with who I am or my life, and I would rather not have been born at all than be born like this. How can we respond to a friend who's going through that kind of experience? What would you say?
Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
In some ways, it feels like almost everybody's teenage experience. You looking in the mirror and it's not quite lining up with whoever the most pretty girl is or whoever the most handsome guy is, and you think, man, I got short end of the stick. But maybe it's even more serious. Maybe this person's in a wheelchair, is a quadriplegic, and can't even feed himself or herself. So you're like, oof, that's, again, pastoral response, theological response. The Bible has people who go through these very experiences. Bartimaeus was blind into being an adult male. There was a guy that was sick at a pool for 37 years. Somehow God allowed that to happen. And Jesus came along and healed this guy as a sign of what was to come. You were referring earlier to when heaven comes to earth, the new earth, and when God makes all things right. This was a pool where sick people would lie around, and if the waters got stirred, the first person in wins. And so presumably there was, 10, a dozen, 20, 100 other people around this pool. Jesus shows up, and it doesn't say he went, whoa, everybody's clear. He just one person. And I don't know why, you've got this particular struggle. I do know this, you've got a choice at this point where you're like, I'm not sure I wanted to be, you didn't want to be born, you didn't choose your parents, all those sorts of things, but you do have a choice right now. And the choice is either to believe that you are on a rock that means nothing, it's pointless, and what you do with your life will never add up to anything anyway. There is no God, no one who loves you. The universe is going to a cold, dark eternity. Or there is evidence that there's a God who loves us, that we're on a broken planet, and the Bible actually is pretty honest about how it got broken. There's evidence for that. And could you muster the baby steps of faith to say, God, would you help me trust you? Would you use this difficult point in your life to say, God, I hate this. I think I might even hate you, but could you make yourself real to me in this difficult, dark spot? And I think that that's the right answer. There's a couple of guys that had similar experience. I think about Job, who suffered. And God allowed that to happen. Why do you do this? Why don't you go around with magic pixie dust, fix everybody fast? People would believe in you a whole lot better and quicker. I mean, God in his wisdom has said, some of this has to wait. I'm not good at waiting.
Yeah.
Is that Inigo Montoya? I hate waiting.
That is great.
Okay, friends, thanks for tuning in. See you next time.